I knew that the rate of homicide fluctuated within different general areas, but one of my initial hypotheses was that men were more common victims of homicide. I just felt like we're in confrontation a little bit more often, and as men, we kind of like resort to like physical action a little bit faster than women do. So one thing I didn't know that there were 420 homicides in America out of the 21,570 in US, which means that we didn't really account for a very big portion of it. And also another thing that I did learn was that the most common source of homicide would be like a gunshot wound, which does make sense when you think about it, and just like how people like strive for like gun control and availability of it with like the freedom to bear arms. But just it kind of puts it in perspective of why people are fighting so hard for gun reform in that sense. So I can say that I I felt I absorbed a lot from this module relatively clearly. If I would retain all of it, I'm trying to kind of make sure that I at least can summarize everything to keep in important details. But no, I feel like I got everything really, really well. So I don't think I really missed any spots. So on intimate partner abuse, I knew that women were more common victims of domestic violence just because they report domestic violence more often than men. I don't necessarily want to get into the idea of that women get like it happens to women more than it happens to men, because at the end of the day all we can go off of is what was reported, and that's not always going to give us the most viable conclusion to whatever we're working towards. And me just like understanding that domestic violence is a more kind of it's a more prominent topic when you talk about like self-help and things of that such, in terms of just like that, you know avoiding the victim mentality and never blaming yourself. I feel like I under it exposed me more so to the different avenues, whether it be safe houses or with the court assistance. I knew that there were different ways for a domestic violence victim to get help, but I was also aware of the fact that at the end of the day, the victim still does have to want the help. So I I was a little bit more closely informed about rape, just in terms of like the actual categories of rape, because I mean, of course, you know that there's rape from the stranger, there's rape from an acquaintance, but you wouldn't think of rape as a marriage partner per se. Like, I don't know, for me, I didn't think of that initially, but when you talk about domestic violence and how those things happen, for me, my first thought would have been, why would you marry someone that is violent enough to try to rape you? But I also thought of the circumstance that what happens if they get violent after the marriage, or like during the marriage and not before the marriage. So I can understand that. One of the previous definitions of rape I found odd was it specifically talked about a married man engaging in unconsensual intercourse with a woman outside of the marriage. So that definition essentially negated the idea that a married woman could get raped by her husband, even though it's very much a possibility. So I most definitely understand why that had to be updated. So when you talk about physical partner abuse, I feel like we could have touched on the more psychological type of abuse. And we did that in terms of like talking about how their lifestyle can be controlled, whether it's implementing a curfew or saying that they couldn't work around people, which is one of the cases that we have went over. So I do feel like we touched on most of the different parts that is partner abuse. So with child abuse, I know that child abuse can occur from different various stages of childhood. Like, I know for me, I hear of child abuse more so when it comes to parents that have either beaten or killed a newborn. just because I usually hear they couldn't get them to stop crying, or they were just so tired, these different excuses. That's more so what I hear of child abuse come from, is that kind of that natural over that quick overwhelming nature of more so young parents. So one thing that I actually learned was that there are actually three different theories behind child abuse: the integral theory, the environmental and psychological, and the environmental sociological cultural theory, and the psychopathic theory. So these theories kind of these theories kind of categorize it for me, and they almost help steer my mentality of it. Like when I think of the environment, or when I was talking earlier about the parents not necessarily knowing how to handle the new child, I feel like that could be a type of environmental change, just because it's a new responsibility and a new outside influence on their lifestyle. You think of psychopathic, or those type. Psychopathic would more so say, let's say they were abused and they developed that type of like that mindset of they need that control. They need to like that's how they're taught to deal with somebody. I feel like that way may get misconstrued with like, I don't know, maybe like spanking your kid. Some people might see that as abuse, just because you were popped, so you think that's the best way to deal with your kid is to pop them whenever they do something wrong, which I most definitely agree with. But I can see how that one could get stretched to that misconstrued meaning. And lastly, another thing that I was able to remember was that 60% of all child abuse actually comes from a member inside the family. I mean, you'd think that would be more so the case, as bad as that is, but that's who the child is around more so when it's like unhindered by outside influence. That is who they go to. That is what they're like. That is unfortunately their situation. Even though that's supposed to be their safe haven, that's where they go. That the outside really can't get to them, or they usually don't get to them in time to make a difference before the damage is done. So honestly, I feel like I learned a lot through these lectures, through these lessons, I should say. I was able to understand more so with child abuse. I was able to understand it more in depth than my superficial knowledge. I can say it helped me kind of steer my thoughts clearer to what I had initially gathered. So for me, I don't think that I need to go over anything else in terms of try to revisit or anything of that nature, because I already I had an initial idea, and so with these modules, it didn't necessarily like expose me to anything. It kind of helped me guide my thoughts a little bit better.